And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys, it's been many months since I've done a podcast, and uh, you know, I'm inspired tonight by this story by Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Buckner, who is under fire by the liberal media and from feminist groups that are demanding that the Kansas City Chiefs cut him because of his statements concerning his Catholic faith. And challenging the cultural norms of our liberal society. Speaking at Benedictine College in Kansas, he was giving a commencement speech, and he just kind of went off on what was on his mind about everything wrong with our society, our civilization, and everything that's just unraveling before our very eyes. And it was very interesting because he came at it from his Catholic perspective. He mentioned things like the horrors of abortion in our nation, women in the workforce and the problem that feminism has brought to our society. He specifically went after Joe Biden, calling him a fake Catholic, and basically hit on a lot of traditional Catholic notes that has offended the liberal sensibilities, and the mainstream media now is calling for his head, basically, and they're calling for the NFL to basically discipline him, Kansas City Chiefs to cut him. Social media has gone crazy in this liberal society, and it's very fascinating to watch it all play out because it's a nerve that Buckner hit because we have been descending into moral chaos now, well, for many decades. But I think more directly, we could probably go back at least to the 1960s, at the turn of the sexual revolution, and what it has meant for many of these issues that now present themselves. Obviously, abortion being the most horrid of the social destruction we've had in America, and touching on that at a time where it seems like, well, the forces of evil, the left, it seems to be winning because as this moral dysfunction, the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of culture continues to deteriorate, we're losing that steadfast moral sensibility that was the bedrock of the old world and Christendom. As I've told you so many times before, the West and America and the liberal West post-French Revolution, in many respects, has been running on the fumes of Christendom, but those fumes are just about all evaporated. And now we're living in a quasi-socialist, communist sort of paradigm now, which makes morality very subjective. And Harrison touched on some old traditional Catholic values that offended liberal sensibilities. And I think one of them, the one that really hurts, or the one that really, hit hard, was his comments on women. And I'm just going to basically paraphrase or just touch on these, but basically saying that women have a vocation to be mothers, to raise children, and to be in the home. There's something of great value to that that's been lost, and that women pursuing sort of the economic, engine of prosperity and trying to climb up the corporate ladder at the expense of family and motherhood leaves a lot of women in a great state of disarray and leaves them shallow and empty in regards to sort of a fulfilling life. And of course, in a society where we base truth off dialectic materialism, well, this is a problem, right? And we've seen this for the longest time. Now, there's lots of nuance to this kind of a discussion because, in many ways, we live in a society that's forced women to go out into the workforce. Now, a lot of women are choosing it because feminism has indoctrinated in their minds, first of all, to reject the idea of patriarchy, and second, to go out there and pursue their own material ends, right? And because we are a society, again, that bases so much of material dialectic or dialectic materialism, that you can understand why women have been gravitating to liberalism and feminism as Christianity and the faith has broken down. And see, and while we have the far left and the progressives flipping out over this, I think it's a twofold problem. Obviously, for the progressives, that are long and far gone in regards to your traditional morality. It's also a problem of the right, because the right always sets up the left to take the ball and run with it in liberal societies, right? I've said this before and I'll say it again. The moment the classical liberals rebel against Christendom, and they undermine old world Catholic values, and simply turn the world into this naturalistic utopia that they're trying to create. With that, you undermine the moral law. And by undermining the moral law, and you bring in things like egalitarianism in, where you're trying to make women equal to men. Now, let's remember, in the old world, it wasn't like women were suppressed like they were a lower citizen. It's just that men and women were always seen as complementary creatures. Now, we're going to get all kinds of, you know, liberal, garbage about the suppression of women, things of that nature. But as somebody whose family came from the old world, I can tell you that women had a strong foothold, right? In the family, and could dictate within the home much influence and power over the home, right? I'm reminded of that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Remember that one? When Tula wanted to go to college, and the father, being a traditional Orthodox man, started crying, basically saying, "Why do you want to leave me?" Trying to make her feel shame and guilt. Basically telling her, "Yes, I want you to get married and make babies," right? And of course, after the father storms out, the mother basically has to cheer her up, takes her aside, and says, but the man is the head of the house. And the mother responds and says, "Sure, the man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck, and the neck can make the head turn any direction she wants," right? This was the complementary nature of the old familial world that worked very well for a long time. And we didn't have a society with all these social dysfunctions. Women understood their role, men understood their role, right? And for all the talk about patriarchy and male dominance, it was actually a much easier world for women in many different ways, as they could take up their natural role of motherhood without the stresses of modern society. If you believe that the social and moral dysfunctions of modernity that include rampant divorce, rampant abortion, rampant sterilization of women, rampant relationship problems that we see today, the hookup culture, the sexually transmitted diseases, and the porn issue, all the moral dysfunctions we have. If you don't believe that's a byproduct of sexual revolution and unleashing feminism, then I don't know what to tell you at this point. It doesn't take a genius at this point in history to figure out that the West is off kilter. And it's even beyond off kilter. I think we've taken a leaf off the cliff, and we're tumbling down for a crash. I'm not sure this can be saved anymore apart from a grace from God. And yet these liberal entities still hold on to everything they can in order to believe, while the entire moral compass of the West has collapsed. But then again, from mainstream public figures, I don't expect any better, right? These are the elites that control the narrative. These are the elites that are paid very well, that live comfortable, material lives in order to preach sort of this demonic message of sorts. And so, again, that is from the progressive side. But from the right, uh, again, we've had this on the political right, this libertarian notion now for about 50 years, since the end of World War II, where we're not going to discuss morality on a societal level, right? The right has always told me that morality, faith, religion is a personal affair, and that we have no right to dictate morality to anybody else, right? Especially with us Catholics, where we tend to have a faith that's more public than, say, Protestantism, right? Protestantism is a very privatized faith. It's a subjective interpretation of sola scriptura, a subjective interpretation of the Bible, where everybody can internally follow their own clock, so to speak, their moral clock, so to speak, and follow whatever moral dictates they want. But Catholicism, the old world Christendom, never operated. The Catholic faith was a very public faith. And so for us Catholics, when we speak out on this, the answer has always been, at least in my lifetime, from the political right, is, "Frank, why are you pushing your morality on other people, when in fact you could practice your Catholic faith. Nobody's bothering you. Why do you want to push it on everybody? And of course, we've always known that the moral breakdown of America would eventually lead to greater societal problems. And this has been me for the past 30 years of my life, pointing out many of these social dysfunctions that have come about from taking a very lenient position on morality, this sort of privatization of morality that many in the political right, the conservatives and the libertarian types have taken. Because under this concept of freedom and liberty, this abstract idea that we push in America, nobody knows how to evoke or implement proper moral structures within a greater society without contradicting the ideas of freedom and liberty in a moral sense that we've encompassed at least since the sexual revolution. If you want to go back to pre-Civil War, when we had state churches, things of that nature, that's fine. That's fine. I understand that was a little bit different back then, and we could discuss that some other time. But in the current American ethos, we believe that morality and religion is a private affair. And as I've argued for so long, that's a recipe for disaster. So, I mean, what do you effectively have here? You have the unleashing of feminism in the 1960s. It's soon followed by a rash of moral dysfunctions, beginning with the pill, contraception, being made over the counter in 1961. What we see after that is one event after another throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s that leads to the complete moral dysfunction of our society. We get contraception in 61. We get, soon after that, pornography legalized. We get abortion legalized. We get homosexual marriage legalized. We're on the verge of making everything transgender legal. Just go down the list. It is one event after another. Contraception launches this moral decay, right? It launches it because it fundamentally changes the nature of men and women, where before contraception, men and women were complementary creatures that work together. Now contraception changes that relationship between the two, and why men have been under assault since the 1960s by feminism, right? Constantly being shamed and blamed for their nature, constantly being blamed for the historical nuances of history and some things that have come in the past. Men usually getting the blame for that world. But the irony of it all is, look at the world since the 1960s. Look at the destruction of our culture, our society, and our families. We've never seen a moral collapse of this magnitude. And it all stems from feminism and these disordered relationships we have created now by these new social norms, these rebellious social norms that have ultimately come from some far left communist entity that really began a century or two earlier. I mean, you could argue that it's communism, cultural Marxism. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think really we have to go back to the Enlightenment, and even more so to the Protestant revolt, right, in the 16th century, where religion became very subjective through private interpretation of scripture and the breaking away of the church. So, yeah. So when you see this, and the liberal world is now going haywire, crazy, because now the argument, of course, is that Harrison Beckner wants all these ladies to be barefoot and pregnant in the home, when in fact, that's not necessarily the argument per se. That is a caricature to diminish the role of the woman in the home. Always has been, right? Because most women that I know, and this is me, right? Despite what you see in the media, there's a natural inclination to want to be mothers. No matter how much you want to run from that, in the liberal world, many women want to be home, being with their mothers. If you are so far left and so far liberal that you, especially these young ladies that are raised in New York and California and places of that nature, and you've been indoctrinated to climb up the corporate ladder, to pursue the economic and your prosperity, to pursue the material dialectic as we've been convinced in modern society, that's fine. I get that. But that's not a natural inclination. I don't believe it's a natural inclination. I know many women that will tell you that. What is fascinating to me is, and how feminism has screwed women throughout history, well, since the 1960s, is we had the inflation of the 1970s that forced many women to go into the workforce because now we live in the world where two incomes had to be necessary in the household in order for that household to survive financially. Ironically enough, this inflation we're going through now is probably going to put us in a position where you need three incomes in order to survive. But the 1970s is what begins to push the woman out of the workforce. And for many women that I know, right, those that don't have a grand microphone on NBC or CBS, those that I consider and call paid actors, right, by the liberal establishment, many women are done with this liberal society that has forced them to serve at the feet of a boss, right, at the feet of a corporation rather than to serve their husband, and vice versa, the husband being the caretaker of his family. This has brought so much social disorder and dysfunction. It has destroyed the family. And women have been left holding the bag in many respects, saying, wait, is this what feminism was? Is this what it was for me, simply to work 50 years to get to what? Retirement age of almost 70 and then to die, to be away from my family, to not be able to raise my children home, to drop my kids off at a daycare or public schooling that's indoctrinating them with all this quasi-communist indoctrination? This is the deal that we cut in this liberal society of feminism. And I can tell you, many women feel betrayed by feminism and are beginning to rebel against this idea. The problem, however, doesn't come just from the far left. It doesn't come just from the commies, right? It also comes from the political right of America, the classical liberals that have ousted Christendom to the wayside. And in that, in that respect, they've created purely a society based on materialism. And so when religion becomes a private affair rather than public affair, then people don't have to subscribe to a general, greater, broader sense of morality and virtue. Virtue and morality is in the eyes of the beholder. It's to each their own. And we've seen a complete breakdown of civilization. Put it this way. If you remove the faith as a public entity, where the only thing that the classical libs have really pushed is dialectic materialism, and that is simply the accomplishment of materialism in the world, then how do you tell women to stay home and make babies when fundamentally there's no inherent worth in a material sense to stay home and raise children? This is the essence of the argument, because feminism has used the empowerment of the material dialectic of materialism and making the money in America as their primary principle to push women out and to create, or should I say, to break down this complementary role that women and men had at one time. The right has done this, right? I remember for, a good 15, 20 years when I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh. I mean, what was the basis of the greatness of America? It was summarized in a few little talking points. America is the freest nation in history of the world. We spread freedom and liberty. We create economic prosperity. The economic engine of the world, of course, is America, and we'll spread freedom. And then, we'll go to other nations, and we don't want to kill you. We want to do business with you. We spread materialism here, there, and everywhere, which is a complete contrast to the old world, right? When we fight and die in America as soldiers or military, when they go overseas, they're fighting for freedom and liberty, right? And to spread this economic prosperity. That is, in a nutshell, what America has always stood for. But in the old world, we fought and died for Christ. I mean, that's a completely different idea altogether, because materialism, while it was important in the sense that we all need to work in order to eat, create economic commerce, to make our living standards a little bit better, it wasn't the highest ultimate end of that society. To serve God first and foremost was. In this society, in this liberal society, all we do is push the material realm, right? We ask, for example, every presidential debate, what is the main talking points? Jobs, 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 and GDP numbers. That's all that matters. This is why when we start to bring up things like the societal collapse of the family, for example. Well, that's off hands, right? That's what libertarians have preached, at least in the 90s or early 2000s. And many conservatives tell you, Frank, why push your religion on anybody else? You could go to church, you could practice your faith. Nobody's telling you can't practice your faith. Just don't push it on anybody else. But of course, as society has broken down, those ideas seem silly. And we're at a point now, it's fascinating to me because it's conservatives now, right, that are saying America's done. It's over. We are a collapsing empire. Where just 10, 20 years ago, it was so rah, rah, rah. We're number one. We're the greatest of all time. Now, there's been a bunch of things that have happened, and that leads in the powers that be have really demoralized us by taking more and more power. The elections seem to be very, I don't know, fruitless at times for the political right. And you can only take so many losses until you begin to question yourself and the entire system itself. And the political right is there now. But I'd like to remind everybody that this collapse that you guys are now talking about didn't start just with Joe Biden. It started many years earlier, particularly with the moral collapse that was happening through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And whenever we integralists brought up these issues, I said, wait a minute, we can't move forward. We're going backwards. All this moral dysfunction, it's going to break down the family, and then it's going to break down the culture, and it's going to affect the political system where we're here. You guys didn't want to hear it a decade or 2 decades ago. Now you want to surrender and say, okay, it's all done. It's over. It's going to collapse. I think you may owe a few people a few apologies because in many respects, the conservatives and the libertarians have helped facilitate this by not fighting on the cultural end, by surrendering on the cultural end, and by accepting religious indifferentism has created moral chaos throughout the entire nation. And here we are all of a sudden, and you guys are now waving the white flag. You don't trust the political system anymore when many of us were warning you, right? Why don't are you going to send us now to our churches? And this is what's interesting about this, because remember the deal that many Catholics cut when they came here as immigrants. The idea was, okay, you Catholics, you can practice your faith privately. But this public worship of God, like you did in Europe, that's not allowed. You could come here, you could partake of the mature dialectic. We need the workforce. We need the lower class, underclass workforce to support the infrastructure of America. But don't you dare bring in your public faith to this nation, because we believe in individual liberty and also religious liberty, where anybody can practice anything it wants in the realm of religion. That's why it's so odd, it's so strange, it's so crazy that we now live in a time in America where Catholic churches and even Protestant churches could literally be sitting next to satanic churches, right? As the rise of Satanism is coming about now, right? That Christian soldiers can fight on the battlefield right next to Satanists. That's a crazy concept. Nobody in the old world would have thought that was ever possible. But again, under the concept of religious liberty, religious freedom, right? Regardless of what you may say about the 14th Amendment, because I know many certain Catholics would argue that's when it all went bad, that America was a pretty good crypto-Catholic republic up to that point. But I'm talking about governance today, right? I'm talking about where we've come, and this is the direction the nation has come. I don't really care if there was a poison pill in the 14th Amendment that destroyed the Constitution, destroyed America, right? I don't care if the founding fathers put it there. We're here now, and we have to govern now. This is a large part of the problem for many people on the right, is that the right has never learned to govern. The right always deals in ideology and ideological principles. This is why the Glenn Beck types are always telling you, we gotta get back to the founding principles of America and the Constitution and the founding fathers, the greatest man of all time. Fine, appeal to ideology, but how do we govern, Glenn? Conservatives have never known how to govern. We're here post-Enlightenment, post-World War II, communism has spread all over the world, including America. How do we correct this problem? There's no going back to the founding, first of all. And even if we can magically jump in Doc Brown's time machine and go back to the founding principles of America, there's no guarantee that we can't avoid the same problem anyways, because apparently the 14th Amendment shows how there was a poison pill in the Constitution. It would happen all over again. That's the point here. And so when conservatives are saying to us, hey, don't worry about it, don't impose your morality on anybody else, right? Don't let anybody tell you how to worship God. Well, you got a problem here because we have to have some common values. And where we're at now with feminism, the destruction of family, the destruction of the culture, everything that we've gone through as Americans, all the moral despair that we have, all the moral chaos that's broken out. I mean, the Looney Tune behavior of the new generations that haven't had proper formation in the faith, but also haven't had strong families to bring them up to give them proper catechesis and formation in life. The chickens are coming home to roost. And now we got to hear the liberal society go after Harrison Buckner because he's preaching old values that actually worked at one time. Really? You could bring up all the little stereotypes that the liberals have made up about history, and that's the irony of it all, right? The political right oftentimes uses the same stereotypes to malign the old world. But that's what happens when you betray your ancestors. That's what happens when you betray the faith. This is what happens when you betray the church. This is what happens when you betray the civilization that gave you the liberty to be here in the first place, to have a revolutionary, rebellious attitude about everything. And it was the classical liberals that rebelled against the old world, and now it's the offspring of the classical liberals that have rebelled against them. I'm sorry, I'm not buying this notion that the progressives of today are illiberal, right? That's one of the excuses, because apparently liberalism is the idea of sharing ideas. Well, BS, right? Liberalism is about power. It's always been about power from the very first day. This is why liberalism spread through great military destruction all over the globe. We saw it all through Europe throughout the 19th century. We saw it with two world wars culminating, and now we see it every day. Every day, just bringing this destruction. And if you don't submit to liberalism, a pound of flesh will come down. This idea of this altruistic freedom, it has never really existed. And now we're paying the price. Harrison is just going back to a world that made sense, where men and women were complementary to each other, where they worked together, where we had big, strong, vibrant families, where cultures were rich, the faith was being practiced, in complete contrast to what we have today, right? A rotting culture, broken family, and a Western culture that is in a complete state of apostasy at this point. I just don't think it's a coincidence that the West, under the dictates of Christendom, had all these positive notions. The first of which, the faith, was alive. It was vibrant. It was rich. It was real, and it protected culture and family, and gave us all these things that are so necessary for healthy human beings to live their lives and govern their lives. And yet, within the realm of liberalism, under these abstract ideas of freedom and liberty, it's all collapsed. I'm just saying, it was very refreshing to hear Harrison Buckner just come out and go off and explain to the world and many young ladies how they have been deceived, because their mothers, but even more so, their grandmothers, were all much better women. Just like in our times, my father and my grandfathers and my great-grandfathers were much more better men than I am. Because this thing we call liberalism, this grand revolution that started 200 years ago, 400 years ago, pick your date, has consumed all of us. We're all broken at this point. And the first sign of that is we have amnesia, that we're not willing to acknowledge the sins of the past and how the rebellious nature of liberalism has brought us to the brink of collapse. We double down on freedom, 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 which in the end is destroying us. That's the irony of it all. Harris Buckner, kicker, field goal kicker of the Kansas City Chiefs. God bless you, brother. Keep preaching the word. I got your back. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.